Hello and welcome to this artist talk as part of the Mac Live program. My name is Jack Self. I'm an architect and editor-in-chief of Real Review magazine. I'll be speaking with Stephen Shaw to discuss his brand new book, Steel Town, which is now available via the Mac website. Stephen, good morning.
Hi, Jack.
I very much doubt that Stephen Shaw needs an introduction, but in the incredibly unlikely situation that you're not familiar with his work. He's an American photographer. He's known for capturing images of everyday life. The subjects, objects, and places that he depicts are sometimes called banal, although in this context, I would say that banal is a positive word. His work embraces a kind of intensely radical banality. Amongst his best-known works are certainly Uncommon Places and American Surfaces. Today, though, we'll be focusing on your new book, Steel Town. And I wondered whether we could perhaps begin by you summarizing what the book is about and how these photographs came to exist.
Sure. They were done on commission for Fortune magazine in 1977. Fortune had made a decision to go from a monthly, which it had been since its inception, many decades previously, to a fortnightly magazine, I think to be perhaps more temporally relevant. And in deciding to publish more frequently, they cut the trim size of the publication and the page count. And so this was going to be there was going to be one last old Fortune issue. And this was their last chance to run a large photographic portfolio in the tradition of Walker Evans, who'd been an editor at the magazine for years and produced many extraordinary photographs for Fortune. And so they approached me as a photographer working in the tradition of Walker Evans with this project.
You then went to Steel Town. As far as I can tell from the order of the photographs in the back of the book, which is chronological, you seem to spend about 6 or 7 days there.
Yes, and I photographed in 3 regions, Western New York State, Western Pennsylvania, and Eastern Ohio. And I'll tell you how I think not the photographs came about, but the book itself, which is in 1977, toward the end of the year, the Museum of Modern Art staged a major retrospective of my work. And in preparing for it, I went through my whole archive and looked at these pictures and realized that they were made exactly 40 years before. And this was in 2017, as I said, which was when I was looking at them several months after Donald Trump had taken office. He was elected partially because some traditionally Democratic states, or states that traditionally voted Democrat in presidential elections, like Pennsylvania and Michigan, had voted for him. And this was the area that's become known as the Rust Belt. And I realized these pictures were at the very inception of this economic downturn in the region. And so that they recorded a historic moment that had repercussions 40 years later.
I mean, what's quite fascinating about that as well, you mentioned Walker Evans, but of course, the moment at which you're taking these photographs in 1977 must be almost exactly 40 years between the work that he did during the Depression. It's quite amazing to imagine the passage of time and these works capturing something of a kind of moment of great change. At least for me, what I find really remarkable about these images is the familiarity in some sense that one has. I mean, if one thinks of the images that Walker Evans captures in a material sense, they look very foreign to me. They don't look like a time that I can recognize at all. And yet in the images of Steeltown, the scenes remain remarkably and kind of uncannily contemporary to some of the backgrounds that you see in Make America Great Again, promotional videos and so on. I wonder what your reflection on that might be.
As I drive around the country now, there are certainly visual changes, the development of big box stores and commercial strips. But the old cities look surprisingly similar.
Mm.
If I were to go off an interstate and at random and go into some small town, which I do when I'm driving, I need gas and I pull off and I go into a town, it doesn't really look that different. I think there's something else, which is that I think if it's possible that a photographer is in the moment when they're photographing, that they're in a kind of experience of nowness, that there's an element in the picture that still feels present.
Mm.
So specifically what I photographed was to a large extent determined by the magazine. They had sent a researcher out who visited these cities and these mills, who made contact with the United Steelworkers Union locals in these cities, and through the unions had access to people and places. And so a certain kind of groundwork was done for me. I would say one of the delights of a project like this is that it gives me access that I wouldn't have otherwise on my own. And it gives a context and focus to a small body of work that is different than my getting in a car and just driving around the country. I mean, it becomes a project. And so what I photographed were towns that we begin to see closed storefronts as businesses slowly begin to go out of business. I photographed the workers and their homes. I had access to some parts of the steel mills themselves. One of the things that I think interested me in art that has specific cultural or political ramifications is, can it transcend the immediate period?
Mm.
Can it, if it's only about steel workers, its lifespan is limited. But what I find interesting in reading history is that a good historical account feels like something universal is being touched. in the specific. And I think I see that in some art and some literature, that they can discuss or illustrate something temporal, but at the same time feels like something that can speak across time.
Absolutely. I mean, we've discussed this before, but this question of both being timely and timeless, I think, is a fascinating kind of quality. And the value, I think, of a lot of the work that you're describing is its ability to speak both about a specific condition and to, in effect, collapse time, and in a strange way, to collapse presence, or collapse two contemporary situations into each other. When I was looking at the photographs, of course, I couldn't help but notice many of the seeds of the subsequent 40 years present in the images. We see abandoned stores, as you mentioned, particularly department stores, small shops, independent stores that are closing. What for me, when I started, I took a very forensic approach to looking at this book, and I approached it in a couple of different ways. The first was to look at the subjects and to look at what had changed and what remained the same between the two periods. It's not so obvious, actually, because there's so much which feels very familiar. Particularly, the only real material sign of difference in some of the images, for example, of diners and breakfasts, is the presence of an ashtray. That's really the only thing that's changed. But in other instances, there are things which speak to a different type of society altogether, and were probably already out of date at the time that you were photographing them. I'm thinking particularly of things like billiards halls, which were shutting down, or cinemas that were going out of business. And then the other thing which really struck me was the types of houses that you were photographing as well, not just in the interior, in which there was a kind of strange homogeneity in the interior. Almost every single interior was a mix of contemporary styles, which, being the late 70s, tended to focus on kind of floral patterns and browns and greens and oranges, but then also the presence of what you might call, I think Americans call this kind of traditional objects or traditional furniture, so kind of Quaker armchairs and things like this, and even small models. In one image, I think it's a scale model of a boat. It looks like the Mayflower. If not, it's something similar. And the houses themselves are unusual because I can't think of any model that exists in contemporary society for them. They're clearly working class houses, but they're of a scale and substance which speaks to quite a wealthy working class, which is also something which is kind of unfamiliar, I think, today. But this question then of, at least for me, of this collapse of time, and of how the ability to communicate across decades, I think it has a lot to do with the way in which the photograph is taken itself. And I wondered whether you could say something perhaps about where you were in your career then, and maybe how it compares with the present, in terms of what you were saying about the presence of the photographer in the attempt to capture the contemporary.
There was a lot in what you said, and I had as you were speaking, I had many thoughts. I'll answer the last one first and maybe work back. For the previous, perhaps 5 or 6 years, I had a couple of things on my mind as I was working. One was to explore the country, and the other was to understand the formal variables of photography. And after taking hundreds and hundreds of pictures and spending years doing it, I found that my formal questions were at this time beginning to stop arising. And what I mean by arising is, I think for a number of years, for about 5 years, the questions arose almost seemingly on their own. It wasn't I sat around my loft in New York and thought about what am I going to explore now. As I was working, these kind of burning questions would come up. And at this point, they began to stop. It did kind of linger over the next year. There were other things I wound up dealing with. But the process was winding down. And why I'm saying it is this. If you do something long enough, you begin to get a handle on it and you begin to internalize it. I remember photographing, I spent a month or month and a half photographing the New York Yankees spring training and had complete access to the field and dugout. And I was sitting in the dugout one afternoon next to Reggie Jackson, who was a great Yankee right fielder, talking to a rookie and explaining to him that he had been watching him and that when he swung the bat, he was stepping forward a little bit too soon. And what I noticed was he probably saw lots of things he could correct with this young player. He knew that if he gave him more than one thing, he couldn't do it. It would be too much on his mind. But he gave him one thing that he could work on, and that if this young player worked on it long enough, he would begin to internalize it and then could move on to something else. And if you internalize enough of these decisions, you can trust your, I'm not sure what the word is. It's not instinct, because instinct is sort of inbred. It's not intuition. It's this other thing of internalized learned behavior that one can begin to trust. And we do it all the time. If you drive a car and are parking it, when you first parked a car, you didn't have a sense of how large the car was. How you probably were very scared of pulling alongside when you're parallel parking the car to your right. How close can you be? And then you learn it, and then you don't have to think about it anymore. It becomes internalized. And this same process can happen in art. And I think and had happened with me with all the formal decisions that went into making a photograph. So that now I could approach a project and not have to think about it in those terms. That I could, and this was probably looking back, I would say the first project or the first group of pictures where I found I could begin to just trust what I had learned and perhaps even more be in the moment.
Oh no, maybe there's another aspect to that though, because I think in terms of what you're describing as a kind of formal mastery, the ability to kind of establish for yourself a series of internally consistent conventions, which of course are so well practiced and so well rehearsed, and decisions that have been made over very long periods of time that they no longer become conscious. Of course, that also makes me think as well that there's a technical component that sits underneath that. I'm always amazed when I was looking at your photographs. There is an incredible consistency in. I really, again, got very forensic about it. So I looked at every single angle of every single approach, where a curb falls, where a road falls, how much sky is present or not present, what the divisions across an image in their proportional relation might be. And I'm amazed as well by the ability to do this through, of course, a technical apparatus, which is not the human eye. So you're also working with the camera itself as a form of technology, in the same way that when you mentioned driving a car, I guess there's the artistic expression of driving a car with flair, but then there's also the basic technical understanding of its limitations and its possibilities. Presumably that also led up as one of these kind of chapters in the development to leading up to this kind of moment in your career.
Yes, and I think there are different phases of mastery. That there is a kind of technical mastery, which is the driving of the car. In photography, it is a familiarity with materials. A black and white photographer can literally see in grayscale. There's a switch in the mind, and you see in grayscale. When I'm looking in the back of my 8x10 camera, the image is upside down and backwards. My mind flips it. I don't even think about it. Every time I get a new lens, I use it exclusively until I know the lens, which means I can walk down the street and without even thinking about it. It's not like I can even think, what would this lens do? So I see like that lens. And I can stand in a spot and without even thinking, no, I want my 240 millimeter lens, not my 300 for this shot. And I know where to stand because I know exactly what the lens is going to cover. And there's nothing mystical about it. It's just, if you do something long enough, you become familiar with it. In 1976, all the time in the 70s while I was working with my 8x10 camera, there was only one manufacturer of 8x10 color negative film, just until the very end of the 70s. And that was Kodak. And I was limited to, this is their film. And in 1976, they switched from Ectacolor, which they discontinued, and replaced it with Vericolor. And I had to learn a new palette. And my pictures changed. The angle to the subject, the kind of light I worked in, the palette was different. And I had to learn a new film. This is the technical mastery. One subtle aspect of this in color, I'd mentioned black and white photographers can see in black and white. I think one problem people working in color often have, I feel looking at their work, is that they don't see in terms of the film. They just see the world in front of them. When I was working, I was very aware that I was seeing like a particular film and paper combination, which is tricky because it's not as divorced from what my eye sees as black and white is. It's the color world, it's just the colors are a little different. And the way light is rendered is a little different. And so, and now with digital, it's very hard to do because there's so many variables, and it's, you know, there are so many filters that could be used, not to do extreme things, but to see like different films. And it was easier when there was one color film and that was it. And I had to learn to see like it. But I know I'm giving you a very long answer. The technical mastery is the basic foundation. And then after that, what I was talking about through the 70s was a formal mastery that builds on the technical foundation.
And so you arrive towards the end of the 70s, having achieved both a technical and formal mastery of photography, and you're asked by fortune to go out and do this commission. presumably that's a moment then of quite a good deal of freedom. I would imagine quite a lot of artistic freedom in terms of then your ability to focus on reality. I'm really interested, in a sense, if we're talking about this ability to communicate across decades. I wonder if you can recall at all what your state of mind or your creative approach at that moment was towards the things that you were capturing, how it is you went about looking at the world.
Honestly, I don't remember. It was now more than 40 years ago.
Mm.
And although I would say, just based on more recent experience, I did a book in Ukraine about the work was done about 10 years ago. And I think if I were to describe the working method, was that I found I've come to a point where I could go to a place, even if I was not familiar with it. I might have done research in advance. In Ukraine, I read a number of books, and in Steeltown, I had the research of what had gone before, but also read the newspapers and was aware of economic and political situation. But go to a place with fresh eyes and somehow make contact with what is unique about the place. What feels essential to the place or to the time. But I don't exactly think about it. I just, when I'm working, a lot of the time, what I'm doing is I just do the work. I don't have thoughts in my head. I just go into some other state where the work takes over. But the work takes over based on a foundation of past experience and knowledge.
Yeah, this kind of accumulation of knowledge. We've talked about it, let's say, in first in the technical term, then within a certain artistic practice. And I think what we're beginning to discuss is almost like an intellectual or creative mastery, which is also internalized. The reason that I say this is because one of the things that strikes me so much about the images in Steeltown is the way in which you manage to capture so much of the spirit of that time, whether it's the protests by steel workers who are just out of a job, whether it's the kind of this real turning point in the kind of post-war boom is just coming to an end. We're just beginning to see the forces of globalization really affect the way in the everyday life of Americans. And you manage to capture in each of these photographs, in some sense, some symbol or some indication, I would almost say like a representation, a physical representation. And yet at the same time, I don't think any one of these photographs could be described as a cliche. And I wonder if it's that relationship. I mean, I mentioned at the very beginning this word banal. I'm very interested in how that movement between objects and people and places which stand as representative or indicative of a particular moment can often, if not handled the right way, very quickly slide into their own pastiche or their own kind of cliche. And so I'm wondering as well how, in the choosing of your subject, the framing of the subject, and the way in which you go about that, whether there's also not a kind of series of internalizations which occur in order to choose that, such that it can stand in as a broader example of a particular condition, but also not at the same time be reduced solely to that. At least that's what I see very much in your work, not just in Steeltown, but of course in the subsequent work as well.
The one time I heard Walker Evans speak was in the early 70s at MoMA. I think it was at the time he had a retrospective there. And what he talked about was his pictures as being transcendent documents.
Mm.
And I think what he was saying was, there is a kind of photograph which stands for or engenders a state of mind or an emotional state. And the word that had been used in photography was equivalent. This was Alfred Stieglitz's word. And Stieglitz photographed clouds and called them the series The Equivalents. And he picked a subject that was culturally neutral, so that the psychological, emotional resonance wouldn't be about content, but about tonality and form. He saw them as musical. But I think what Evans was saying was that a decade or so after Stieglitz had made those, Evans could go out into the real world and add to this the resonance of real world objects that did have cultural meaning, that themselves had significance and resonance. I'm going to say two things about it. One is, in terms of this book, when I'm photographing a house and including a church in the picture, I'm aware that I'm doing this. And I understand, or a house or a street and you see the factory in the background. This is a choice I'm making because I understand how it affects the meaning of the picture. The second thing I want to mention is something that's been on my mind just the past day, because I was doing a little writing yesterday. I've been writing about some early aesthetic experiences and how, when I was in my mid-teens, I was going to lots of movies and learning the history of filmmaking. And one experience that stood out for me was seeing Orson Welles' film, The Magnificent Ambersons. And what struck me about it, and now I'm talking about now 1964, a long time ago, was that the structure of the plot, the structure of each shot, the structure of the camera movement, the structure of the editing, and the structure of the sets, especially the interior of the Amberson mansion, were all of a piece. They were, in other words, what I learned was there can be a unity of mise en scène. And how a photograph is structured, what the content is. All of this comes together to possibly form a unified whole.
Of course, in the Magnificent Ambersons, the one of the most famous scenes is an extremely long panning shot up the central staircase of the house, in which two of the protagonists are walking and talking. And it's well known the incredible technical difficulty of achieving a rig that was able to both rotate and rise at the same time. And the reason I mention this is because, of course, the incredible technical feat which is required on the part of the director to understand the mechanics of making such a machine, as well as the effect that will be achieved through the camera itself, is actually in the end completely erased. All one really gets is a certain feeling, a certain mood, which is, of course, of two characters speaking. And in a way, I wonder if there's not a comparison as well to be made between the technical mastery, the formal mastery, which in the end, actually, the objective is much like driving a car, to render the car invisible, and in fact to then concentrate purely on the experience of being in a particular moment and a particular place. I don't know if that's something you would agree with.
I would totally agree with it.
That's what makes me so interested by these works in Steel Town, which is the ability or the sense one has still now when looking at them of being in a particular location in a particular moment. And I'm also really interested then by the fact that, of course, I couldn't possibly expect you to remember what your thoughts were when you were taking these photographs 40 years ago. There's also a great benefit of that. As one ages and one begins to accumulate decades, the work that comes from earlier periods has a kind of familiar association. We recognize a lot of ourselves within it, but it also stands with some separation and allows us some distance or reflection. And I'm wondering if that's also not in some way related to this idea of the contemporary, which, at least for me, the contemporary is, on the one hand, being able to be completely present in your own time, completely accepting of what that means. And on the other hand, always maintain a certain distance from it, certain criticality. And I think in these photographs in Steel Town particularly, this is so in evidence for me, the fact that the photographer is both very present in a location and also somehow at a great distance from their own time. I mean, I wondered if that was something which you relate to or which is important to your work.
Yes, it is. I think there are a couple of things come to mind as influences in those terms. One is my 3 years spent with Warhol, where he took a kind of distanced pleasure in culture. He would see something and kind of say, "Oh wow, look at." It wasn't cynical. It was distanced. He was certainly not buying into it. It was almost an amazement at this is how things turned out. The other thing that I thought of as you said that was one of my favorite English novels. I would go further and say it is my favorite novel in the English language. Is Moby Dick. And I read it first, I guess in my 20s. And I'm sure I'm going to get the quote wrong, but he says, "Canst thou be like the great whale, cool at the equator and temperate at the pole? Canst thou be in the world without being of it?" And I think that's what you're saying.
I think if I understand that correctly, it's about a kind of incredible material presence without, I mean, what you were describing before is almost like, I think in contemporary discussions of criticality and criticism and this idea of divorcing yourself from the present, it almost always comes with a negative sense of judgment. And that idea that you can be somehow removed from something without passing judgment on it is, I think, quite an incredible quality. And I imagine is also very necessary for that idea of communicating something of the human spirit, the human condition across multiple decades, whether that's through photographs from the late 70s or whether that's through the difference between, reading ancient texts written 2,000-3,000 years ago, which can still maintain some sense of the contemporary in their ability to talk across a universal situation. I'm wondering as well, in that sense, to what extent the kind of everyday objects that you focus on. I mean, I mentioned at the very beginning that for me, Walker Evans often seems somehow much more archaic, or at least it's a world which is less familiar to me. Of course, there are many reasons for that. One is that there is a bizarre feedback loop in this part of our century with the period in which Steel Town photographs were taken, where you spoke a little bit about digital. photography. But of course, there's now so much digital simulation of the aesthetic of the 70s itself, which creates a kind of strange collapse of the two times. But I also think there's something common between the work of Walker Evans and your own work, in terms of, even if one doesn't find the objects themselves still familiar, even if they don't look like the cars that I might drive or the streets that I might frequent, it's the selection of the subject matter itself as somehow indicative of a form of daily life. Objects that would be familiar to the people who would see them at the time, which I think also creates a strange familiarity in the work. And at least for me, when I see these images, I know that these objects, while not familiar to me, would be familiar to the people of that time, and that somehow collapses the distance between us. I'm kind of interested in how you began to think about, or why you began to take this great interest in everyday life and in the objects that are familiar to people.
It wasn't something I ever planned. It simply was what I gravitated to. In thinking back about it, I would say perhaps a turning point for me was the series American Surfaces. What I wanted to do was, I saw too much visual convention in my photography and in a lot of photography. And I wanted to go beyond it. I wanted to take pictures that were more like seeing, where you had talked about a kind of transparency before, where a transparency in driving. This was a kind of a transparency in photographing. And the way I tried a number of different approaches to try to get beyond my own conventions. And one was to do conceptual work where some of the decision, exactly where I was going to stand, was taken out of my hands and was the product of a conceptual formula. But that didn't solve it for me. That wasn't right. I also tried taking pictures where I learned from camera mistakes, where pictures that were taken accidentally and just or randomly, what does that look like? And that wasn't it. That wasn't really like seeing either. So what I did was, I engaged for a while in a mental exercise, which was at random times during a day, not when I was out photographing, just going through the day, take a screenshot of my field of vision. The word screenshot didn't exist in 1970, but that's essentially what I was doing. I would stop and just be aware. This is what I'm seeing. When I'm having a conversation with someone, when I'm talking on the phone, I'm riding in the back of a taxi, I'm eating a meal, I'm walking down the street, in just average moments in a day, what does it look like to see? And I used that as a guide to how to take pictures. But at the same time, it made me aware of those moments. So I was looking at not just how do I see what's in front of me when I'm in the back of a taxi, but what do I see? Or not just how do I see when I'm having dinner, but what am I seeing? And it's not just the plate of food, it's what the material of the table is, and other things that are within my field of vision. And so I think that while I was intending to get beyond a kind of formal convention in how to see, that process, without it being its intention, started opening my eyes to getting beyond conventions of content too, and looking closely at at just the ordinary world in front of me. I add one other thing, which is that throughout photography, there has been an expanding of content. And it's not simply photographing something because it hadn't been photographed before, but finding meaning in something that hadn't been photographed before. As what we photograph, a photographer can break new ground, find meaning in something that hadn't been photographed before. And over time, that itself becomes a convention. And when it becomes a convention, it becomes a cliche. And the bar needs to be moved. And a new language has to be discovered. I think of the work of Bill Eggleston as an extraordinary example of someone always exploring new territory. Not just for the sake of new territory, but for finding meaning in it.
I think that that question of what constitutes a valid subject of artistic practice is, of course, such a kind of long historical discussion. And I think you're absolutely right in what you're saying.
That when you said historical discussion, I thought of the experience of in the Accademia in Venice. There is the first large gallery you get into is kind of early religious art. A lot of the work, it's all religious. The work is heavily gilded. The next gallery, we enter the Renaissance, and it begins with paintings that are immediately much more natural than the previous gallery, but are religious or historical or mythological subjects. And at the end of the gallery, it spans like 100 years, and you see this change in 100 years. At the end of the gallery is a Giorgione called La Vecchia, of an old woman who's not a patron of the artist, who is not a religious figure, not a historical figure. It's simply an old woman. And it's just so striking that an artist, and it's painted with such attention and beauty, that this is not someone just taking a picture of an old woman. This is someone spending hours of their life to make this extraordinary rendering of this ordinary person.
How are we to understand then, I mean, in terms of what you were saying about formal and technical mastery, you've also just described a process in one sense which can be tracked along that lineage, which is the history certainly of Western art was initially perhaps a certain pursuit of realism, at least since the Renaissance, that's been the case. And in the early days of photography, photography was rather dismissed except as a means for capturing things in a realistic manner. Of course, it then really in the 20th century began to develop conventions and models and subjects which went far beyond anything as an extension of painting. It became its own medium. I'm also interested, though, at the same time, that the particular period that you chose from, say, the late medieval through the Renaissance is also a period in which the idea of faith, the idea of a certain structure of the universe as being incomprehensible to humans is slowly, and therefore one filled with supernatural and magical forces of various kinds, gives way to, during the Renaissance and leading towards the Enlightenment, the birth of the scientific method, the focus on material reality, and the idea that rather than taking ideas and ideologies and imposing them onto the real world, instead we can draw from what exists around us lessons and ideas, which perhaps culminates in Karl Marx's idea of historical materialism, that ideas are a product of the material conditions from which they emerge, and not the other way around. I mean, not to draw too direct a link, but in the work of Steel Town as well, we see this very clearly, in which all of these grand narratives, these grand ideologies, which we have spoken about, are visible in the material world itself. They're not metaphors at all. They're physically there. And I wonder if that process as well, if we think about a much longer tradition of art, isn't also about slowly learning to accept the material world as it is, or at least focus on what really exists much more than perhaps what is a figment of our imagination.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it has to do with the strengths and limitations of photography. I was just this morning engaged in a written interview about the book. And the interviewer asked me about, was I denouncing the conditions, the economic conditions that led to Steel Town? And I thought of photography is not good at denouncing. It's not good at explaining.
Mm.
For example, I could say, and I proposed this in what I wrote this morning, take this following couple of sentences. One of the many factors that led to the closure of the mills was the steelworkers' unions themselves that had fought modernization because they were afraid that modernization would lead to the loss of jobs. And that led to, and now the antiquated mills couldn't compete with the more efficient steelworks in Japan. How can that possibly be photographed?
Mm.
And it's simple two sentences that reveals a kind of levels of complexity that this is not a simple situation. But what photographs can do is describe, and it can deal with cultural forces to the extent that those forces manifest themselves visually. And so that's what the photographers who go into the built environment have learned from experience to be sensitive to and to look for. There is, I used the term equivalent before, but I think another term, T.S. Eliot in his essay on Shakespeare, on Hamlet, uses the term objective correlative.
Mm.
And I think that might be, in a way, a useful description, that it's to be aware that that when we're seeing things in the world, we're seeing them as outcroppings of forces, and that what we're seeing can, in a work of art, be an objective correlative of something deeper.
I think that's a much more poetic and direct way simultaneously than in terms of what I was trying to say earlier about objects both standing in as, in a sense, symbols of a condition and also speaking for themselves. But I want to come back to this idea that you mentioned of photography not being able to, or having a great capacity for denouncement, but rather for description. Maybe one of the things as we move towards the end of this discussion is that really struck me about these photographs is the faces on the people that you captured. There isn't a single one which is joyous, which is at ease. Almost every single person looks somehow uncomfortable or as if they've just received bad news. I wondered to what extent, and of course that communicates the quality of their life in a far more visceral way than in fact some of the other more obvious signs like closed stores or protest signs, for example. I wondered whether, and of course my kind of reflection on this is that you were capturing a moment in America where it seems like the grand narrative of society has begun to be exhausted. The kind of meaning and purpose of why they exist in the place that they do has begun to evaporate. And I think much has been said of a lot of the social contracts and social pacts underpinning that, which began to fray apart. But I'm interested as well, and I think for me, this is one of the reasons why the appearance of Steeltown at this moment is also of such incredible relevance, is because I couldn't speak to you without mentioning, of course, the pandemic and the current situation that we find ourselves in that also directly after a really tumultuous period of political history in the US. And it can feel, I think, especially to a lot of young people, but not only, that society today is also lacking in some of those grand narratives, that in a sense, there's a big question mark over what our society is for and why we are here. And I wondered whether there was anything, you had any reflections on this, and the junction between these two time periods seems quite uncanny in a way.
I do have reflections. I'm just going to speak as an amateur observer of the world and not as a photographer. But you had mentioned forces that began to come into play during the Renaissance, and an interest in reason. And as you said, led to the Enlightenment and scientific revolution. And I think what we are experiencing is that there might be an end game to this process. Some things in history are cyclical. Some things are trends that come and go. They're waves washing on a shore. And some things have the arrow of history, and the expansion of knowledge is one of those. And I think of all the inventions, one of the things that struck me in that Renaissance room at the Academia was how much history was compressed into 100 years. And we saw that similar kind of thing in art of the 20th century. We see certain inventions, a history of inventions that change culture, starting, let's say, with the printing press. But in the past 150 years, the telegraph, the railroad, telephone, electricity, automobiles, radio, television, computers, atomic power, the atomic bomb. Each of these leads toward a kind of globalization. I don't mean globalization in the political economic sense. At the same time, you had mentioned how the size of the workers' houses, and that it looked kind of prosperous. One of the features of the better union jobs that were being lost was that they paid well, and that a person could not go to college and have a middle-class job, that they can own a decent house and a couple of cars and they worked hard and had a hard working life, but had a good life. And these are the very jobs that are the most vulnerable to not just outsourcing, but to computerization, robotics, and artificial intelligence. And when politicians promise, I'm going to bring back middle-class jobs, other than a grand work project, such as the one Biden has proposed, it's very hard to bring back these jobs. Not that they'll all disappear, but I think this is part of the fear running through some of our culture is that we're seeing these profound changes that are not going back. I think, I don't know if you had the opportunity to hear Biden's address to Congress this week, but he spoke directly to these people with, I think, a great deal of empathy, not acting empathetic, not saying, I feel your pain, but I think genuinely, having come from that kind of background himself, understanding the tenuousness and fear that they experience in this the kind of changing environment of our culture. And I don't know what the answer is to it.
Of course, I'd hope that I'm so conscious of your time as well. I didn't want to go on too long, but now that we've entered into this, I'm afraid I really have to ask just one more question in this subject, which is what you just described, to me, speaks very much about the relationship between conservative and progressive and nostalgia, in the sense that, and by this, I want to try and remove these from any political sense. I'm not talking about liberals or Republicans or any party politics, but at its core, at least for me, to be conservative means that you want things to remain the same, and that often you think that the past was better than the present, and therefore that maintaining that past is of great value. And you can be conservative and still vote on the left wing, in the same way that you can be progressive and belong to the right wing. I would argue that neoliberalism from the Reagan era onwards has been incredibly radical and progressive in its restructuring of society. And progressives basically say, well, the present is not great and we should try and change it and create change into the future. At least for me, the fundamental kind of issue with both of these is that humans by their nature, I think, are conservatives. They're quite worried about change. And so progressive parties, which tend to be on the left wing, have a fundamental disadvantage in politics because they're trying to say to people, we should change things, which sounds risky, sounds worrying. And yet I'm interested in the reason I mentioned nostalgia is because you described before this process of photography, and before that of art in general, constantly changing what it considered to be a valid subject of artistic practice. And I'm aware in your own career of an almost total absence, or what appears to be a total absence of nostalgia. I mean, almost every couple of years, it seems, you have embodied in it an almost reinvention of the way in which that you work. And so I wondered what your approach to nostalgia was, and any kind of ideas about this apprehension of change, or a fear of embracing it, let's say.
I know that some people write about my work from the 70s as being nostalgic, but I see that they're being nostalgic. When the work was being shown, people were saying, why did he photograph this? It's just like what the world is like. I realized fairly early on that when I find myself repeating myself, I lose interest and want to move on. When I see myself falling into some kind of visual convention or some aesthetic convention, I question it. And so, for example, for the past 5 years, I've been posting on Instagram every day.
Yeah.
And I've stopped because I can't just do it forever. I'm not interested in doing it forever. And I'm not saying I may not go back to it. The last time we spoke over the summer, I was still in the midst of it and had no intention of stopping. And I want to say something else about change. I think, we've gone through, in the past several years, an extraordinary period of politically socially, the pandemic, environmentally. And if I wanted to, I know what I said about the decline of the middle-class job and that it may not come back sounds pessimistic. But I also have this thought in my more optimistic moments, that Shiva is the god of destruction and the god of creation. And that the extraordinary turmoil the world has gone through in the past several years, culminating in the pandemic, may be the fertile ground for change. That the people who may have been hesitant might not even intellectually think it's time, but they may deeply accept that it's time. And so again, looking back on Biden's address to Congress this week, here's a person who has been in his whole career, 50 years in the Senate or in Washington, a fairly moderate person, in a way stepping up to the moment and proposing things that a few years ago would have been radical. And this may, but not doing it, he's not doing it in a firebrand, messianic way. My sense is he's stepping up to the moment, but at this moment, a moment of great anguish may be the grounds for change.
I think that's an optimistic message for us to conclude on. I would certainly agree with what it is that you're saying. I want to thank you so much for your time today. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't remind everyone that they can get your new book from the Mac website. So thank you again.
Thank you, Jack. Always a pleasure to talk to you.